Alright, so in this video we're going to talk about painting our buildings for the bird's eye, ant's eye view. And what I have completed so far is the sky with the salt technique. I have also completed two of the buildings. And something I want you to think about is you can't really paint wet paint by wet paint because it'll just run together. And so since we have groupings in most cases, for most of us anyway, it is to your benefit to maybe paint a building here, then turn your paper and paint a building here, and turn your paper and keep doing that. So that as you get back to this area, this brown building has had a chance to dry. And it's not to say that your paint will still run, or won't still run, but it's just, you have a little more control over what's going on. So you have two options when it comes to painting your buildings. One of them is that you can use the watercolor palettes like we've been using, or if you would like to use marker, you can. The marker does open it up to more colors, variety of colors, whereas what's nice about this though is I can do some mixing of paints better here than I can with markers. But a lot of it's just your preference. So as you begin, you probably have already noticed, we talked about it with the sky, that if you get the paper wet first, the paint is going to move around. And so as I begin this building, I'm going to go ahead and pre-moisten the surface. I just took my brush, the tip of my brush, and got a little bit drier because I want to get just the tip of it into these tiny little areas. Whereas now I'm going to dab it in water and get this just a little wetter. And up here. All right, and so now it's time to add color. Well, I want you to think in terms of somewhat realistic, but don't worry about it being perfect. So for this one, I'm going to go ahead and do kind of a grayish color, and I'm going to take a little bit of black paint on my paintbrush. I don't need very much because black is a very strong color, and I can always go back and add more if I feel like it's just not dark enough. Now you notice this is already spread quite a bit. That's because the paper was wet. And so at this point, I want it to be a little bit lighter gray. So I'm going to dab off some of this black that's on my paintbrush. I'm going to go ahead and use my paintbrush to pull it to the other direction. And it is essentially, it's like we're shading with our paintbrush here. And if you find that your paint or your paintbrush really isn't doing much, you can get your paintbrush wet and then a little more liquid to this. That's the benefit of the watercolor paper, is it allows it to re-moisten or pick up some of the paint that was on there before and it's dried. But what I like about this so far is I like the fact that this side of the building is just a little bit darker. It adds a little bit of dimension to it. So I may or may not leave it that way, but I'm going to go ahead and fade this out just a little bit more. So obviously, this is painting with your paintbrush. Now something to consider is the fact that with the marker I can get very straight edges. Here I got a little lucky, this one's straight, but you can see on my brown building I had some areas that weren't very straight. So you need to think also in terms of marker, what's going to work better for you. So this is drying. I'm now going to turn my paper and work on this building. And with this building, or this grouping of buildings, I'm going to go ahead and put, I'm going to try the marker technique this time. And so I'm going to go ahead and put some gray down. You can see this gray is a lot different than that gray. And I'm just basically putting an edge on it. I'm not outlining, but putting an edge. I'm going to go ahead and bring that over just a little bit. And again, since we're using water-based markers and we're using watercolor paper, I can take my paintbrush. I have quite a bit of water in here. And take my paintbrush and liquefy the marker. The Crayola marker, black and gray, tend to have a bluish tint to them. There's some blue pigment that's used to make them. Watercolor in general is meant to be a very light painting. And so our goal is not to have really, really dark, intense buildings. That's more of an acrylic or a tempera paint, whereas watercolor is meant to be pretty light overall. And so this is using marker. If I wanted to, I could apply a little bit of marker on this side and kind of blend it in that way also. The other thing to think about is for those of you that did your sky, you can come in with a little bit of color that you used in your sky now that it's dry, and maybe get a little closer to the building if you want to, kind of perfect those areas. But now when it comes to the windows are probably going to be gray, light blue, yellow. If you want to do more of a nighttime, it's really going to be up to you. But what's nice about the markers and windows is if we do this right, we can almost get a look of glass. And I'm going to try it up here with yellow. It's a little harder with yellow, but we'll see what happens. And so I'm going to go ahead and get just the corners, and you notice I got opposite corners here. So I put a little bit of this down, and I'm going to approach it real slow here. I'm going to say, you know what, we'll try it. If it doesn't work, I can always add a little more once it dries. The key being once it dries. And so it did fade. And what I like about this is it's giving this impression of uneven glass, because glass tends to shimmer. So I've got dark here and kind of fading in. And I'm going to let that dry and come back to it. And I may add some actual streaks with the marker. I may do a little bit darker and build it up some more. But I would probably end up doing most of my building windows in yellow now that I've started with that. So this just gives you kind of a layout, either using the paint palette or markers to paint with. And again, keep it light, take your time, and we'll go from there.